Good day. Today is Saturday, 24th January 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you've watched this program or whatever part of the program you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Now, yesterday in my program, I discussed at very, very great length the meeting that took place in Moscow on Thursday between President Putin of Russia and the Americans, Witkoff, Kushner, and Grünbaum, Josh Grünbaum, who is involved in setting up President Trump's board of peace. And I said that on the basis of what Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, has told us about this meeting, it seems that the main purpose of the meeting, at least in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, was for the Americans to provide information to the Russians about all the various discussions they've been having with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans since the last meeting between President Putin and the Americans Witkoff and Kushner in Moscow on the 3rd of December. Perhaps I should rephrase that. It seems to me that what actually seems to have happened is that the meeting provided President Putin an opportunity to ask the Americans questions and to try to get some understanding of what discussions the Americans have been having with the Europeans and the Ukrainians since the meeting between Putin and the Americans in Moscow on the 3rd of December. The one thing that came out of the meeting on Thursday was an agreement to set up a working party involving the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Americans, which would meet on Friday and Saturday in Abu Dhabi. And I discussed in my program yesterday that this looked to me to have been decided upon by the Americans, perhaps in light of the drone attack on Novgorod, the angry reaction about that drone attack in Moscow, about which, by the way, I've had more information over the last 24 hours, and the Americans were anxious to get that affair behind them and to try to get negotiations, or at least some kind of movement in the discussions between themselves and the Russians on Ukraine and perhaps other issues back on track. Now, as to the reasons for that, it's perhaps worth saying that over the last few hours, the Pentagon has issued its own new statements of its doctrine, its new strategies, its new overall defense strategy. And it seems to me that the people who are behind the drafting of this new, specifically Pentagon strategy document are essentially the same people who are behind the security strategy review, people like Elbridge Colby and Mr. I believe Michael Anton, who has, by the way, departed from the US government, but who I understand still has some role, perhaps, in discussing these matters with other US officials. And this document from the Pentagon, which I myself have not seen, I've not been able to locate it so far, though no doubt it will be circulating fairly soon, says, again, that the overall priority for the US Armed Forces is to protect the American homeland, that is now the number one strategic priority, that protection, defense of the Western Hemisphere of North and South America, and North America, by the way, includes Greenland, according to the American formula. Anyway, this is essential. Apparently, it's essential for the United States to exercise control over the Western Hemisphere in order to preserve the heartland, to protect the American heartland. And again, outside powers are not to be allowed to be involved in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine is being revived, though in a much more confrontational and aggressive form than the original Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s. And there's also, incidentally, talk now, after the Venezuelan operation, of the United States imposing an oil blockade of Cuba in order to bring that country into line. And there's even reports that the United States is now trying to find officials within the Cuban government that it can bribe and corrupt and win over in the same way that it bribed and corrupted and won over officials of the Venezuelan government. All very disturbing and very ugly. And in the case of Cuba, I suspect a more difficult place to find people like that. And to repeat again a point that I've made in other recent programs, the Russians are referring to Cuba as an ally, and something they never did with Venezuela. And I suspect that an American oil blockade of Cuba will provoke a stronger international reaction than American actions against Venezuela have done. But anyway, the point about all of this is that even as the Pentagon talks about a hemispheric strategy, it also talks in this review, apparently, about the necessity for the United States to focus most of its military forces in the Asia-Pacific region. In other words, to take on the big current enemy of today, which is China. And this Pentagon document also talks about scaling down significantly US operations in other places. In Europe is mentioned specifically. Russia continues to be identified as an adversary, but a manageable adversary. And the Europeans are told in this document that the moment has now come for them to take over their own defense. Now, those of us who have a classical education will remember the famous letter that the Roman Emperor sent to the Britons in 400 AD, just before the Roman Empire began to crash, informing the Britons that the Roman Emperor, the Empire, had more important things to do and worry about, and that henceforth the British would have to take responsibility for their own defense. That letter, widely seen today as one of the early indications of Rome's fall. Well, I have to say this document that the Pentagon has just published appears to me to be saying something of the same thing. We can't afford to look after you as we once did. From now on, you people in Europe, you must take responsibility for your own defense. We will retain some presence, but you must do all the heavy lifting from this point on. So this is the background to all the discussions between the Americans and the Russians that are ongoing, and it's the background of the discussions about Ukraine and it explains some of the reasoning behind the American approaches to the Russians, and it also provides some of the background about concerning this meeting that's taken place in Abu Dhabi, the meeting of this working group, because it's very interesting to see who was involved in this meeting. So on the Russian side, we know, because Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has told us that the head of the delegation is the Russian delegation, is Igor Kostyukov, an admiral, but an admiral of the Russian Navy who has never, so far as I can see, commanded ships, just to say. He is in fact a spy, and he is Russia's chief military spy master, and he is head of Russian military intelligence, of that very interesting and very famous organization known as the GRU. And the Ukrainian delegation is a much more complex, much more confused affair. It includes all sorts of civilian officials. I was wrong, by the way, in my program yesterday when I said that it was headed by Kirill Budanov, the former head of military intelligence. It is actually headed by Rustem Umerov, somebody who's in some ways closer and more trusted by Zelensky. And he, of course, has been Ukraine's defense minister, and he's also the secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. And also, by the way, somebody who is apparently under investigation as part of the various anti-corruption probes in Kiev. But anyway, he was the head of the delegation. Budanov is a member of the Ukrainian delegation. And interestingly, David Arachamia, who is the head of Zelensky's parliamentary faction in the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, he was there also. But an intelligence official, an actual working intelligence official, was also there, and this is General Skibitsky, who is the deputy director of Ukrainian military intelligence. And he, by the way, has also participated in earlier negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians, which took place in Istanbul. Zelensky apparently had not named Skibitsky as a member of this delegation, the delegation that was sent to Abu Dhabi initially, that somebody told him that somebody from the Ukrainian intelligence world needed to come, and sure enough, Skibitsky therefore was appointed. So I've said previously that the meeting in Abu Dhabi looked to me like a meeting mostly between intelligence officers. So we have Skibitsky there on the Ukrainian side with all of these other people. But remember, Budanov also has a background in military intelligence. And we also have on the Russian side people like Kostyukov and other intelligence and military officials as well. Now, we now have also information about who was there on the American side as well. And, well, the trinity of Witkoff, Kushner, and Grönbaum, the people who met with Putin in Moscow on Thursday, they were there. Though, as I understand it, they left earlier today to travel to Jerusalem, where they're going to meet Netanyahu to discuss the affairs of the Middle East. Witkoff, in particular, is involved in far too many things, just to say. But anyway, they were there for at least part of the discussion. But we now know who else was there from the United States, and they were Dan Driscoll, who is the US Army Secretary. He is a senior Pentagon official. He is also a friend of the US Vice President, J.D. Vance. He's said to be close to the Elbridge Colby school of thinking, the same people who drafted the Pentagon review document and the previous security strategy review document. And of course, Dan Driscoll made a big stir back in November when he turned up in Kiev, heading an American military delegation, met with Ukrainian officials, tried to tell them to move forward with the original 28 points that Witkoff and Kushner had been working on, with some input from Kirill Dmitriev. And then Driscoll met with European ambassadors in Kiev, and to their absolute fury told them that Ukraine was going to lose the war, that the war had to be ended because Ukraine was going to lose it. And then shortly after that, he turned up in Abu Dhabi, where at that time Kirill Budanov, still in those days head of Ukrainian military intelligence, was in the process of meeting Russian intelligence officials to discuss prisoner exchanges and that sort of thing. And Dan Driscoll, to some annoyance, certainly on the Russian side, gate crashed on that particular meeting. So Dan Driscoll, who for a certain amount of time appeared to have been sidelined, he's now back at centre stage, and he, it seems to me, is the real chief participant on the American side at this meeting in Abu Dhabi. And there is another American official who is also involved, and that is the NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Alexis Grinkevich, who is also the military commander, the general in command of US forces in Europe. So a very senior American military official. So this meeting in Abu Dhabi was a meeting of military, security and intelligence people. The Russian delegation was made up apparently entirely of intelligence and military people from the intelligence and military world. On the Ukrainian side, there is a senior military intelligence officer, General Skibitsky, and of course Budanov, who undoubtedly still plays a role in intelligence and intelligence operations, was also there. And on the American side, we have two military officials, Driscoll, who I believe does actually have a military background, but who of course is now a civilian, and General Grinkevich, who is the overall head of US military forces in NATO and in Europe. So this was a meeting of military and security people. Now, it's been suggested that the Americans were conducting some kind of mediation role over the course of this meeting, but that's not, as far as I can see, what the Russians are saying. They're saying that this is a working group in which the Americans, the Ukrainians and the Russians were, all three of them, involved. It doesn't seem to me as if the Americans were mediating exactly, though there might have been some element of mediation involved as well. Rather, it looks to me as if they were direct participants in this meeting. And what was the topic of this meeting? Now, about this, we're getting not exactly conflicting accounts, but perhaps discordant accounts. The Ukrainians, Zelensky and his officials, have been talking about the meeting being all about trying to achieve peace in Ukraine. There's been lots of reports that the question of Ukraine's withdrawal from Donbass was again on the agenda, and I have absolutely no doubt at all that that was indeed discussed. But, well, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has said that the focus of this meeting was security-related issues, and somebody who no doubt was a participant in that meeting on the Russian side informed TASS, Russia's official news agency, that amongst the topics being discussed were buffer zones, various control mechanisms, and other important topics. Now, buffer zones and control mechanisms is extraordinarily vague, but it could mean, and I think it does mean, attempts to try to rein in the various drone attacks, assassination attempts that we've been seeing over the last few months, which, as I discussed in my program yesterday, looked like they were getting out of control. The word control mechanisms, to me, implies that, though I do accept that it could have other meanings too. Anyway, this working group met. It met on Friday and it met on Saturday. By the way, as I understand, it was always intended to be a meeting that was going to last 2 days. We've had photographs, pictures of the American and Ukrainian groups meeting. The Russians have always wanted to keep the identities of the people involved in their group secret, which is very typical of the Russians, by the way. And apart from Kostyukov, we don't know the identities of any of the others, and we have no photographs of them, apart, I think, from one of Kostyukov. The meeting, the full meeting ended a short time ago, just before I started making this program. The Russians have said that the media, the press, will not be informed, will not participate in this meeting in any way. The Americans have gone to the airport and apparently flying back to the United States. The Russians are returning to their hotel. There's no clear information about where, at what place the meetings took place, and it's not even clear whether the Russians and the Ukrainians were ever together in the same meeting room. There are some suggestions that the way the meeting took place was that the Russians and the Americans, Driscoll and Grinkovich and Kostyukov and his officials, would meet in one room, and then the Americans would go off and meet the Ukrainians in another room. And, well, the Russians would be conveying their messages to the Ukrainians via the Americans. But perhaps a more accurate way of talking about this is of the Russians and the Americans talking with each other, and then perhaps informing the Ukrainians of their conversations. That, it seems to me, is the more likely way, the better way to understand perhaps what took place. Anyway, we've got no clear information about what came out. Reuters, shortly before I started making this program, said that there'd be no breakthroughs, but perhaps we wouldn't expect breakthroughs if at least part of the discussion, the main part of the discussion, was to try to bring some control over the dirty war. then it seems to me that that would not be something that the three parties would want to discuss in public anyway. So probably we won't have much information of that kind about what this working party actually discussed. But it's also possible, in fact, it's very likely, that over the next couple of hours, after I've made this program, the Russians, the Americans, and the Ukrainians will all be putting their spin on it. And we will get some information, no doubt, from what each of these parties are saying. Now, it's important to stress that this is a working group, and it is highly likely that it will meet again. There are some reports in Axios that the next meeting will be in a week's time, also in Abu Dhabi. In other words, it is supposed to be a semi-permanent format that is by no means unusual in conflicts. It's entirely overlooked that under the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements, working groups were also set up. The Russians and the Ukrainians met in those working groups, and they were supposed to try and find all kinds of ways forward to secure ceasefires and all of those things. And those working groups went on meeting, that working group went on meeting for years and achieved nothing very much in the end, just saying. But this time the difference is that the Americans are there, and as their latest Pentagon document has perhaps said, they do seem to want, for their own very, very practical, very tough reasons, to try to scale down this conflict so that they can scale down their presence in Europe, so that they can tighten their grip on the Western Hemisphere, so that they can then put themselves in a better position to take on China and win, no doubt, against China and re-establish their global hegemony all over again. Anyway, that I think perhaps summarizes the dominant mood in Washington. So they want to start to close this war down, at least to the extent that they can. At least the military, the dominant faction in the Pentagon does. That doesn't mean that the entire US government is in agreement about this, because notice that these are military and military officials who met in this format. We had people from Russian military intelligence. Perhaps the FSB and the SVR also sent their representatives. It's highly likely that they would. But then Russia, unlike both Ukraine and the United States, has a unified, joined-up government where everybody takes instructions from the same group of people, Vladimir Putin and his Security Council. That is not true in the United States, and it is certainly not true in Ukraine. And amongst the people who were conspicuously not present at this meeting in Abu Dhabi were the CIA, who are, of course, the people who have been running the drone offensive against Russia, the Ukrainian drone offensive against Russia, attacking oil refineries, attacking Russian tankers, doing that kind of thing. And nor were the civilian intelligence agencies of Ukraine, the SBU, who no doubt are also working hand in glove with the CIA to conduct some of these attacks. What I would say is that if we are talking about operations deep inside Russia, my guess is that the people who are probably running them are more likely to come from Ukrainian military intelligence as opposed to the SBU. But that might be a guess. It might be completely wrong. It's possible that both of these rival intelligence agencies within the Ukrainian system are battling for supremacy with each other, that they each have their drone operations against the Russians. If that was the case, it wouldn't surprise me at all. But anyway, there it is. So we also, and this brings me back, talking about the CIA, we also go back to that article by Seymour Hersh. Could it be, might it be, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that there's been discussions within the United States government that people like Driscoll and Colby and others have been saying, look, we have to try and find some way back with the Russians. We've got to find some means, some route towards ending this war, at least this conflict with the Russians. It didn't work out the way we expected. The Russians turned out to be far too strong. We are draining our resources, tying down our best people in this conflict with the Russians in Ukraine, where instead we need to tighten our control of the Western Hemisphere, gain control ultimately of Greenland, come after the Chinese in the Asia Pacific. That is the line we should take. That is the way we will restore our hegemony and once again lead the world. Could it be that these people were saying that and were saying after the drone attack on Putin's Valdai residence, this is getting out of hand. We need to move forward with the settlement of this conflict. We need to set up this working party, both to reassure the Russians and finally to get some kind of platform whereby we, they, and the Ukrainians can discuss the day-to-day conduct of the war with each other, where we can talk to the Russians directly and say to them, well, please don't attack this because our people are there, and in return we won't attack that because we know your people are there. Those kind of things which working parties of this kind, contact groups if you like, basically are set up to do. And of course the CIA doesn't like that. They're appalled by it, and therefore they sent one of their people to talk to Seymour Hersh and say, well, we're going to go ahead and do that which we have always been doing. We're not going to pay any attention to what the military, the Pentagon, are doing. We have our own agenda in Ukraine. We still want to win Project Ukraine. This is the solution that we embrace, and we're going to go after Putin, and we are going to do so because we see him as the major obstacle in Russia to getting what we want there, which is ultimately regime change. Anybody who supposes that in the United States there are not factions who argue these things with each other, I'm afraid, is not familiar with the realities of American politics, extending all the way back, certainly to the 1960s. And in this particular administration that we have now, my sense is that things are even more fractious and incoherent than usual, with the president himself easily persuaded to adopt violent and extreme policies, actions, which might contradict his larger strategy at any one time. Anyway, that's my sense about this meeting in Abu Dhabi. They've had some discussions, undoubtedly, about Donbass, but the Ukrainians are showing no interest at the moment in withdrawing from Donbass. I don't believe they will ever agree. I think if the two cities of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are surrounded by the Russians, as I believe they will be at some point over the next few months, well, even then, I suspect the Ukrainians will not agree to withdraw from Donbass. They will insist on further actions by their friends in the United States and in Europe to support them and to rescue them from this disastrous situation in which they will find themselves in. I don't think there was ever any prospect of any kind of breakthrough on that topic in Abu Dhabi, just as there hasn't been at any point since the meeting in Anchorage between Putin and Trump, when apparently the Americans finally agreed with the Russians that the Ukrainians must withdraw from Donbass. And, well, as I said, the Ukrainians have never, ever agreed to that. So anyway, that's one thing. There's no chance that that has been agreed. There might have been a certain amount of progress made on trying to scale down the dirty war. The Americans are saying that the meeting was productive, which doesn't sound to me actually as if it suggests that there was a huge amount of progress. But then these kind of contact groups or working parties are never the places where are rarely the places where great breakthroughs take place. As I said, they're perhaps more a venue for exchanging ideas and information between parties who are locked in this kind of context to keep things under control. And perhaps from that point of view, at least from an American and a Russian perspective, this meeting in Abu Dhabi might have been useful. And as I said, it's likely that this will become, from this moment on, a semi-permanent venue or framework through which the Americans and the Russians, with the Ukrainians hovering there in the background, can talk about the day-to-day events in the conflict in Ukraine and can also bounce ideas off each other and see whether there might be a possible way forward. For me, the most hopeful fact about this meeting in Abu Dhabi is the involvement of Dan Driscoll. He has shown consistently since in the short time that he's been involved in Ukraine war-related matters, that he has by far the most realistic understanding of the realities on the ground in Ukraine of any Western official up to this point. He, after all, is the person who said that Ukraine is going to lose the war and is definitely going to lose Donbass. The Europeans were furious with him for saying it. They were nauseated, as I remember, by what he said, even though, of course, it is true. And given how the Europeans feel about Driscoll, they're not going to be happy that he is involved in this working party or contact group. And the fact that they're not going to be happy partly explains why I am, if not happy exactly, at least, well, I see his presence as a hopeful sign. Anyway, there we are. Now, as I said, we will get more information probably about what this contact group achieved, working party achieved, over the next few hours. But obviously this will be after I finish this program, and I'll return to it in my next program. There might possibly be some big breakthrough. I think that's extremely unlikely, but, well, I'm not going to anticipate further what might come. These are my initial thoughts. As I said, the membership of the delegations, particularly the Russian and the American ones are most indicative, and General Skibitsky's role from the Ukrainian side perhaps tells us a little about what has been going on. I do expect, as I said, this format to become semi-permanent from this point on, and out of the workings of this working party, perhaps in time, other things might grow. But in the meantime, the war goes on, and last night, the Russians conducted what was by far their most powerful attack on Kiev in the war so far. Kiev is in a terrible situation. It was already in a terrible situation before this latest attack took place. Most of the eastern part of the city, on the east bank of the Dnieper, is apparently all but permanently cut off from electric power and heating. And the power stations around Kiev are in a terrible condition. One of the officials, one of the CEOs in one of the key energy companies that supplies electric power to Kiev, said that the situation is close to collapse, that Kiev is facing a humanitarian catastrophe, that the Ukrainians urgently need an energy ceasefire in order at least to mitigate the disaster that is playing out in Kiev. And, well, he said that repairing many of the damaged facilities, energy facilities around Kiev, would also take time and would cost very, very big sums of money, of which, by the way, Ukraine has none. Well, that was said before this latest strike, and this is the biggest, most devastating strike, as far as I can see, that Kiev has suffered in the war up to now. Now, the most interesting thing about this strike was the range of weapons that the Russians, according to the Ukrainians, used. So, allegedly 370 Geran drones were launched at Kiev. Well, we would expect that, but bear in mind, 370 Geran drones, if they were mostly focused on Kiev, would have meant that the sky above Kiev was filled with Geran drones. And simultaneously with that, we had a succession of missile strikes. So there are conflicting accounts of how many Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles were launched at Kiev, presumably from these mobile launchers in Crimea, which are now apparently in service and are able to launch probably more than one Zircon missile at a time. I've seen suggestions that there were 2 Zircons, others say 4, on the assumption that there's 2 missiles per launcher. That would mean that the Russians now have 2 launchers operating in Crimea, if there were indeed 4, and that would explain why 4 missiles hit targets in Kiev. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the target that the Zircons were directed against was, but it does appear to have been some kind of big energy facility. But again, exactly which one and what it was, that has not yet been, as far as I know, confirmed. There are also reports that Kinzhal missiles were also used against Kiev. Again, I don't know in what quantity exactly, but apparently several were used also. And lastly, and perhaps most strikingly, the Russians appear to have used several launched against Kiev several of the huge Kh-32 missiles. These were launched from Tupolev 22 M3 bombers operating over Bryansk region. These are gigantic missiles designed originally by the Soviet Union in the 1960s to destroy US Navy carriers. The Kh-32 is a updated version. It has a new more powerful engine. It has a more advanced, much more advanced, modern electronics and radio guidance system, and it's got a new warhead, a 500 kilo warhead. But this is a huge, very powerful missile. It is not hypersonic. It flies at high altitudes, apparently at Mach 5 times the speed of sound, until it reaches an area close to its target. It then engages in what is apparently a vertical dive, and the effect of the missile when it strikes its target is devastating. Now, Yuri Ignat, the spokesman of Ukraine's air defense system, at one point was saying that up to 12 of these missiles were launched by the Russians. I don't believe it was anything like that number. 4, it seems to me, is perhaps a more plausible figure. But anyway, he then said that the Ukrainians have successfully shot down, well, several of them, 9, I think, which again I don't believe. I remember that earlier in the war, he straightforwardly admitted that Ukraine cannot shoot down Kh-22-32 missiles, and that the Patriot missile system cannot shoot down Kh-22-32 missiles. He also at one point said the same, by the way, about the Kinjal, that Ukraine does not possess the capabilities to shoot down the Kinjal missile. And when the first missile, Kinjal missile, that was launched by the Russians, which some officials in Ukraine claimed Ukraine, using Patriot missiles, had successfully shot it down, Ignat went around for several days denying this, saying that that wasn't true, until obviously he got orders and he changed his story and eventually admitted, or rather eventually said, that it had been shot down by the Ukrainians. The Kinjal missile system had been shot down by the Ukrainians after all. I think that there is a theoretical possibility, a capability in theory that exists whereby Patriot missiles might just possibly manage to shoot down either a Kinjal missile or a Kh-32. I don't believe that this happens very often. In fact, I don't believe that it happens often at all. I've seen one guesstimate, that puts the probability of a Patriot missile succeeding in shooting down a Kinjal at well below 10%, and that only if several Patriot missiles are launched against a single Kinjal. But anyway, I'm not going to engage in statistics. Ignat has morale, no doubt, in Kiev to sustain. So he wants to tell us that several of these gigantic missiles coming down vertically at very high speeds, though not, I believe, quite hypersonic speeds, have been shot down. For the record, the Russians are claiming that the air defenses in Ukraine are now in huge disarray, a Russian commentator, I think from memory it was our old friend Andrei Marochko, said that the Ukrainian air defense system has become a fragmented Frankenstein system, incorporating all kinds of different systems using different technologies, some Soviet, some American, some European, some created by the Ukrainians themselves, that the system altogether has essentially lost its integrity and is no longer operating efficiently. And by the way, and for the record, I believe that is true. Anyway, the point is, all of these missiles were used against Kiev. There is no record of the Russians launching subsonic missiles against Kiev. So we had attacks using Kh-32s, Zircons hypersonic cruise missiles, Kinjal hypersonic air-launched missiles, and apparently, and rounding up the types of missiles the Russians used against Kiev, Iskander-M ballistic missiles as well. And it's been pointed out that one type of the Iskander also launches cruise missiles, I believe 3 at a time. And these have the range to strike targets anywhere in Ukraine. I believe, in fact, I'm sure that these cruise missiles, once they've been launched, become subsonic. But the point is that Ukraine has much less warning of the launch of these cruise missiles than it does when the Russian Air Force launches Kh-101 cruise missiles from deep inside Russia, because the Ukrainians are informed by their Western friends about the takeoff of the Russian bombers from their strategic bases, and that gives them hours' notice before the missiles, the Kh-101s, arrive. Whereas when the Iskanders are launched, there is basically no warning at all. I've heard that the Russians have 24 Iskander launch vehicles operating in the conflict zone, which provides them with a very powerful capability in terms of the number of Iskander missiles they can launch at any one time. So anyway, an absolutely overwhelming strike on Kiev. Now, as of now, I don't know what the effect of this strike is, but given the range and number of missiles used and the number of drones used, it is likely to be devastating. A few days ago, there was a report that 600,000 people have left Kiev. I cannot imagine that after a strike of this kind, with the blackout situation in Kiev getting worse, with the water and electricity and heating systems breaking down, with shops and food facilities no longer fully functioning, with factories and offices no doubt also closing, I cannot imagine that the movement of people out of Kiev is not growing. And the mayor of Kiev, Mayor Klitschko, continues to tell more and more insistently, people in Kiev that the situation is so bad that they should leave. Now, this brings me back, by the way, to Zelensky and his officials. They are still the government of Ukraine. Some people in Moscow, perhaps some people in Ukraine, have doubts about the constitutional propriety of Zelensky maintaining that position. But regardless, Zelensky insists that he is the constitutional legal president of Ukraine. He is so recognized by every country apart from Russia. He has responsibilities for the people of Kiev. I pointed out in several programs that back in 2022-2023, when the Russians first began the war in the sky in a serious way, what John Helmer calls the electricity war, for a short period, even as damage was done to the power generating system around Kiev, but damage on nothing like the kind of scale that we see today. Anyway, for a short time, Zelensky and his officials were busy going around Europe telling the Europeans that the situation in terms of power in Ukraine was now becoming so bad that unless Patriot missiles and air defense systems and all of these things were sent to Ukraine quickly, then the Ukrainians might have no alternative other than to evacuate the cities, and specifically Kiev itself. Well, as I've discussed several times, the situation in Kiev now is orders of magnitude worse. We've seen Ukrainian officials within the energy companies talking about a humanitarian catastrophe in Kiev. One can argue about the morality and lawfulness of what the Russians are doing, though amazingly, hardly anyone in the West any longer is. Just a few months ago, back in the spring, when the Russians conducted far lighter attacks against Kiev, I remember how President Trump used to complain about it. He's not saying anything about it now, when the attacks are so much more powerful. But anyway, one can criticize the Russians, but that should not detract from the Ukrainian government's responsibility, given that there is a catastrophe emerging in Kiev specifically, but arguably also other Ukrainian cities. Kiev was the major target last night, but other cities have also been targeted as well. Kryvyi Rog recently, Odessa many times, Kharkiv, where the situation appears to be even worse than it is in Kiev itself, Dnipro too. The Ukrainian government has a responsibility to the people of these cities. It ought to be taking steps to take them out of harm's way and to evacuate them. And not only is Zelensky doing no such thing, he is in a major argument with Klitschko at the present time. He doesn't like the fact that Klitschko is telling people to leave Kiev at this time. So anyway, there we are. A disaster is playing out in Kiev and increasingly in other Ukrainian cities too. Even as these contact groups and working parties meet in Abu Dhabi, the real catastrophe in Ukraine continues to play out. And, well, we can argue about whether the Russians have hardened their positions, their stance, or not. I would repeat again, I don't get the sense that there were any substantive negotiations at all conducted by the Americans and the Russians over the course of Witkoff's and Kushner's and Grünbaum's latest trip to Moscow, the one that took place on Thursday and the meeting that took place on Thursday night. I don't get the sense that there was any substantive negotiations whatsoever, actually. The point is that even as this slow motion train of meetings, of contact groups and working parties takes place, the real everyday catastrophe in Ukraine continues to play out. And, well, I'm not going to discuss in this program in any detail the situation on the battlefronts. The Russians are saying that their forces are now accelerating their advance west of Seversk, and there's been more changes in the mapping projects, which suggest that the town of Liman is now, well, more and more of it seems to be falling under Russian control fairly fast, and that the Russians are now closing in on driving the Ukrainians out of Grishino, northwest of Pokrovsk. No one, I notice, in the media in the West is any longer maintaining the fiction that the Ukrainians still have a presence in Pokrovsk. That continued for weeks after the city fell. Nobody's talking about this. Nobody's talking about Kupiansk any longer anymore either. The Ukrainians, by the way, have just released drone footage of their drones attacking Russian soldiers in the center of Kupiansk, which is, of course, exactly the territory, some of the territory where the Ukrainians, according to some reports, have pushed the Russians out. Well, the Russians, according to this drone footage, do seem to be still there, and nobody's talking, I noticed, about Kupiansk any longer. But anyway, Grishino apparently is in the process of being cleared. Novopavlovka in Dnipropetrovsk region also being cleared. The Russians expanding their area under their control in the north of Kharkiv region. And from the little information that I can glean, it looks as if the situation for the Ukrainians in Konstantinovka is deteriorating rapidly. The supply roads, in effect, have been closed by Russian drones and by the destruction of the road bridges. The Russians are pressing hard forward in Konstantinovka, and I get the sense that the situation for the Ukrainians in that important city is deteriorating fast. But anyway, all of this continues to play out on the battlefronts. The Ukrainian army continues to experience huge losses. Gordon Hahn, in his latest very interesting discussion, both at the meeting between the Russians and the Americans in the Kremlin on Thursday, and of the overall situation, again says that if this is going to go on for many more months, Witkoff has talked about a final settlement of the conflict in the autumn, in 8 months' time. At the rate things are going, given the devastation in the cities and the realities on the battlefields and the financial and economic pressure, which I've discussed in many programs, there might not be much left of Ukraine, much ability by Ukraine to keep on fighting for 8 months. So Zelensky himself, as I've discussed in many programs, doesn't seem to me to be the sort of person who's ever going to make the necessary compromises to end the war. The Russians have started talking about what they call the Anchorage formula on territorial issues. They've never spelled out what that means. I'm going to venture my own guess, which is that the Russians perhaps agreed with the Americans that the Ukrainians should first withdraw from Donbass, allowing for a ceasefire in the central territories in Ukraine, in Donbass, with no commitment by the Russians to ceasefire in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, but with the situation in Zaporozhye and Kherson region being dealt with in the next stage. The idea being that the Ukrainians should withdraw from the entirety of the four regions before there is a complete end to hostilities, which is essentially what Putin said he wanted at his speech to the Foreign Ministry on the 14th of June 2024, in other words, Istanbul Plus. But let me repeat again that that is purely my own guess. But clearly there was some kind of anchorage formula. But whatever that was, the Ukrainians are resisting it. The Americans have so far failed to get the Ukrainians to accept it. So whether the Russians have hardened their positions or not, whether the Russians are insisting on an eventual settlement of the conflict involving a rediscussion of the entire security architecture in Europe. And by the way, both the security strategy review document and this latest Pentagon doctrinal document suggest that some people in the United States might not be entirely hostile to that idea. Anyway, put that all aside. Whatever the discussions are, I cannot imagine Zelensky agreeing to any of this. So we're not going to see any cessation of hostilities anytime soon. And in the meantime, the Ukraine is being destroyed. And that now brings me back to the topic of European responsibility. We've just seen the Greenland crisis. We've just seen what took place in Davos. If you go to the European media today, you will find lots of anguish, lots of people saying that the situation with NATO is now incredibly dangerous. There's a lot of praise of the speech that the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made at Davos. I'm going to say straight away that I am not a fan either of Mark Carney, and I am not impressed in any way by this speech. Hardly anybody in the mainstream media has commented on its extreme cynicism. Basically, what Mark Carney said over the course of it was, well, we always knew that the rules-based international order was a lie. It was a lie that we sold to the world and to our own people because, well, it suited us. It suited us in Europe to play along because we were there, part of the what the Americans were doing, and we dealt really very well with it. We came away. We were part of the spoils that the Americans, through their various aggressive actions, were able to pull off around the world. So it enabled us to hitch ourselves to the American chariot, and we were the followers, and, well, we did very well out of it. But now that the Americans are turning on us, well, this is really very bad. We can't pretend that this is working out for us anymore. So yes, we did lie to you about the rules-based international order all along, but now we have to admit that it was a lie, and for that reason, because the Americans are now coming for us. We want you all around the world, in China, in the global south, our own populations in Europe, to come to our rescue. There's a brilliant article about all of this by Aris Rousinos in Unheard, in which he talks about how the Europeans basically were like the fish in the shark's mouth, the shark being, of course, the United States, feeding off whatever it was that the shark devoured before the shark could digest it, and thinking to themselves that, well, because they were there in the shark's mouth, they were in some ways part of this great project. What Rousinos' actual words were, it was a form of commensalism, like the fish that live inside sharks' mouths, feeding on the detritus of their hosts' meals, peering out at the world with the optical illusion that they are themselves the fearsome arbiter of the deep. Now they've discovered that they're not, that the shark is actually coming for them. Our own hapless Prime Minister in Britain, Keir Starmer, who has prided himself on his ability to manage Donald Trump, has suddenly discovered that he's achieved no such thing. He's deeply upset about this, and there's now a row underway. In fact, there's a very big row underway between Trump and Starmer about the British contribution to Afghanistan and all of that. Well, all of that is now playing out. And of course, as I said, it's all really very ridiculous on the part of the Europeans. And they now face the prospect that the Americans are going to leave them to themselves to cope with the Russians. That's what this new Pentagon paper apparently says. And in the meantime, the Americans are going to continue to take little pieces of whatever European territory they feel like. And, well, again, there's been some attempts in Europe to say that it was Trump who backed down over Greenland. In reality, as we pointed out on the Duran, it was the Europeans, Mark Rutte, who's just basically told the Americans that they can have sovereign bases in Greenland, bases over which the United States exercises American territorial sovereignty, and that is a massive concession made without the agreement of Greenland. It's a sordid and shabby farce, and there is no way at all that this should be packaged as any sort of victory on the part of Europe. So, what should the Europeans do? Well, there's been all kinds of commentaries and discussions. There's been suggestions about how the Europeans need to achieve their independence from the Americans, how they need to run themselves and look after themselves in this new order where the Americans might be turning on them. But they're doing absolutely nothing. As several people have pointed out, in this kind of situation, the minimum that the Europeans should be doing is trying to find some way back with the Russians. The Americans are talking to the Russians. They've now set up a semi-permanent contact group through which they're going to be talking to the Russians in a formal basis every couple of days, in a week's time, in Abu Dhabi. For example, Dan Driscoll is going to be meeting with Kostyakov on a regular basis now. So the Americans are doing it. The Europeans, well, Macron floated the idea of sending a European representative to talk to Putin. I think it was about a year ago. And nothing has been done. Meloni and Macron proposed it again in December. Still nothing has been done. They can't agree on who they should send. They haven't been able to decide whether it should be Alexander Stubb or Mario Draghi or someone like that. The British remain hostile to the idea of talking to the Russians at all. So do the Poles and the Baltic states. Europe is in a dreadful, worsening mess. Anybody thinks that the Europeans, whatever realization they might have of the extent to which the world is changing around them, are going to do anything positive to extricate themselves and their countries from this awful situation. Well, all I will say is that I can find no hint or trace of it. Given that Ukraine is in this crisis, given that Europe is in this crisis, given that, for all we know, Ukraine might only have a few months left, you would have thought that at this particular moment in time, the Europeans would be telling Zelensky, look, this is over. You have to negotiate seriously for peace. We can't give you more money. We can't give you more weapons. The Americans are now talking to the Russians on a regular basis, and we have no choice but to start to do the same. But if they're going to do it, if the big European powers are going to do that, well, at the moment, they're not providing the slightest hint. Well, anyway, that's me for today. This is where I end today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop, links under this video. Please remember, also, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.